Here is a subtle strategic point. Sometimes it is very bad to be solid at coercion. And I am not trying to be cutesy with my words. I literally mean that getting worse at a particular military strategy can actually yield a better outcome for yourself. And right now, we may be observing the consequences of being average across our world at war. Both Russia struggling in Ukraine and the United States not finishing off Iran. It is fair to describe both Putin and Trump as currently engaging in half measures. This is more obvious in the case of the United States. What started as a serious air war, which I suppose is already a half measure without boots on the ground, turned into an exercise in economic coercion. The main source of leverage that the United States is trying to use is a blockade to and from Iranian ports, with a dash of kinetic action every now and then. Meanwhile, and although I am sure that I will find some Ukrainians who object to this terminology, Russia is still engaging in half measures in its invasion. It might not feel that way being on the receiving end of nightly bombings, but Russia could be doing more. Nary a nuke in sight despite plenty of bluster to that effect. No calls to compel Russian forces to mobilize, despite the invading army losing more soldiers than it can recruit for months now. Okay, those are some interesting points, and it would be easy to look at these situations and leave the discussion there. Or maybe we could go a step further and start theorizing about why states engage in half measures versus full measures. But that is not why you are here. You are here to learn more about the oddities of strategic interactions. And indeed, it gets odd when we start thinking about how an opponent responds to anticipating any of these types of attacks. So today, we will begin with a simple look at the cost-benefit calculations that dictate which strategy a state will ultimately pursue should a war occur. Then we will peel things back one step and examine how crisis bargaining operates under such conditions, highlighting how changes to the effectiveness of half measures lead to some unexpected responses from the opponent. Finally, I will relay these ideas back to what is happening in Ukraine and Iran, focusing on some of the further complications that can arise in these scenarios. But first, we quietly snuck past 100 days of consecutive videos. A lot of comments have asked me how I can keep up with that pace of production. Well, it helps that there are a ton of weird and interesting things happening in the world right now. And I would let you in on another part of my secret, except it is no secret at all. It is the returning sponsor of today's video, Ground News. There is no better way to start my day than checking my daily briefing. Zelensky reports progress with U.S. envoys on Ukraine peace talks. We'll see about that. Or, as the day progresses, examining some of the stories tucked away in the blind spot, items that do not reach one segment of the political spectrum. Ukraine's Flamingo missiles hit Russian factory producing key drone components. That's more than 1,000 kilograms of payload. But why pay a load for this when you could go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen and take a fantastic 40% off Advantage plan, which gives you access to all this and more. So thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Back to the strategic problem at hand. We want to know why hurting one's own capacity can ultimately prove helpful. Fortunately, I can pinpoint exactly where our intuition breaks down. We can all agree that the expected outcome of war is a critical component of war planning. My belief about it dictates whether I should continue to fight or accept a particular set of terms of settlement. It is why mountains of intelligence organizations spend even larger mountains of money trying to get good estimates about what that will look like. For us, it is easy to simply plot it on a country and say, look, it's there. It is even easier to draw it randomly on the country, without regard for whether it is accurate, when all we are trying to understand is how bargaining works, conditional on whatever it is that they actually think. But those real humans really do have to figure this out to the best of their abilities, and that means thinking through various trade-offs. No country in the history of mankind has ever tried to literally produce as much military power as possible. You can get close to it if you look back to World War II and the crazy amount of investment that went into arms production, never mind the millions of men mobilized to battle. But most wars are much more moderate than that. The Kremlin, for example, tries its best to portray a business-as-usual attitude along the home front. It is not fully effective, of course, but it is plausible enough to have some just go with it. Meanwhile, in the United States, if you never looked at gas prices and did not turn on the news, you would have no idea at all that a war is happening in Iran. The point is that the real, actual version of an expected outcome is not simply drawn on a map. It is the accumulation of months of planning, trying to understand what militarily works, and appreciating the real cost trade-offs that come with one plan versus another. What you ultimately choose depends on what gives you the most power at the most reasonable price. And I apologize for emphasizing basic cost-benefit calculations, but trust me that there will be a twist here in a moment. As the leader of our country, my generals have handed me a list of military options. Each generates a unique quantity of expected benefits. Each also comes at a unique amount of costs. Thus, I have a series of benefits minus costs. At the risk of stating the obvious, I should adopt the strategy that has the largest value in this third column, benefits minus costs. Simple enough, right? Well, sure, until you realize that there is a strategic component to military coercion. I internalize both my benefits and my costs. My opponent, however, does not internalize my costs. He only internalizes my benefits because those benefits are zero-sum. The stronger the military option is, the further the expected outcome line swings out in my favor. Good for me, bad for my opponent. Now, you might imagine that one of those options on my strategic menu is incredibly powerful. I will win everything in dispute, for sure, if I adopt it. In turn, I would love to leverage the threat to use it against my opponent to cower him into submission. Then I could obtain everything that I want without having to pay the costs associated with it. That is the great part about using the stick instead of the carrot. When the threat alone works, it is free. One potential problem. My opponent must actually believe that I will follow through on my threat if bargaining breaks down. And as powerful of a strategy as this is, its cost is even larger. My opponent would just call my bluff, making me look like a fool in the process. Consequently, the thing that really matters is whichever option is best on my list. Benefits minus costs. So far, so good, and still simple. But let's drill down on my choice from my opponent's perspective. He really does not like it when I would select a high benefit choice. If we end up fighting, that is what will determine the expected outcome. He will be obliterated. And even if we stick to bargaining to resolve our differences, his true red line radiates away from that expected outcome, meaning that I could conceivably extract more out of him in our negotiated settlement. Okay, now we can get to the really weird part. Imagine my menu of options has just two choices, a half measure and a full measure. The full measure, by definition, is more powerful than the half measure, more benefits associated with it. In contrast, the half measure will generate fewer benefits. It may also be slower to produce those results, creating frustration for everyone observing the activity. More on that in a minute. Think about which one I would choose as a function of the cost of the half measure. The net value of my full measure is unchanging in the cost of the half measure, so that is just a flat line. The value of my half measure obviously decreases in the cost of it, so it is sloping down. And outside of the trivial case where a free half measure is still worse than the full measure, there is some cost that makes me switch between the two. Below the critical cut point, I prefer the half measure. Above it, I prefer the full measure. Again, if we were not living in a strategic world, obviously I would be best off having a free half measure. Either I would still prefer the full measure, in which case this question is irrelevant, or I would prefer the half measure, and I would get it without having to pay a dime. But think about what my opponent's bottom line is as a function of my costs of a half measure. Below the cut point, I am implementing the half measure, and my opponent is not hurt much by it. Above the cut point, I am now implementing the stricter full measure, and my opponent is scared. His bottom line suddenly drops off a cliff. The same oddity arises if we look at this as a function of the strength of the half measure. In the non-trivial case, when the benefit is small, I prefer the full measure. But as the benefit gets larger, eventually I switch to preferring the half measure. My opponent's bottom line still looks weird. When I prefer implementing the full measure, it is still very low. When I switch to preferring the half measure to save costs, my opponent's bottom line suddenly jumps up. It then decreases as we further increase the strength of the half measure from my perspective. Note further that even if worse half measures also affect the quality of the full measure, say because I put boots on the ground on top of imposing a blockade, this effect still arises so long as the full measure is not impacted as much. So no matter how you cut it, I can have more extractive leverage over my opponent when my half measure is worse than when it is better. Being average at half measures is possibly a worse spot to be than being outright bad at them. And the reason is simple. Bad half measures make my full measures credible. Now, insofar as I can control the offers exchanged at the bargaining table, this means that I can achieve better negotiated settlements. But let me be clear. If bargaining will break down, then worse half measures will make me at least as worse off as before. Same goes if my opponent is the one capable of dictating the proposals. The other note worth adding here is that I was pretending like the opponent's costs do not change as a function of my strategy. In reality, the full measure usually imposes greater costs on the opponent too, which actually amplifies this effect. Circling back to Iran and Ukraine, there are two coherent thoughts that the previous grunt work helps us understand. For one, as observers who mostly watch these conflicts and only directly internalize a small portion of their costs, it helps make sense why both fronts are seeing scant progress. If Putin thought that, for example, his half measure of contract soldiers was less effective or weaker, not that this is happening right now, he would confront a couple of alternatives. One would be to expand the war by going into full mobilization. The other would be to just give up, a third option that we did not discuss before. It shows a sign of weakness, and it increases the chances that Putin will be done. That is probably not the right way to look at it, though. He would be trading his own personal risk to further increase pressure on Ukraine. That is, on net, a bad thing for Kyiv, although obviously it does make this whole thing a lot more high leverage. Meanwhile, over in Iran, the United States has made a clear choice to drop down on the aggressiveness scale by ending major aerial operations, and instead switching to a blockade strategy. Or at least that is true while I am speaking these words. We are in the middle of an escalatory spiral, and I will not be publishing this video for a few days. So if you are wondering why the war has just stalled out over there, at least as of right now, that is why. The type of progress happening in Iran has slowed by design. If the blockade were more costly or less effective, or something changed in the world causing one of those two evolutions to happen, then you might start observing a return to a serious aerial campaign or limited boots on the ground. Now, things get especially interesting when we start discussing the welfare implications of worse half measures. Remember, the benefit there arises when you can use the threat of full measures to extract more out of your opponent in a peaceful settlement. Obviously, all of the aforementioned parties are at war, so that is not happening. But it is possible that if the stronger measures were credible, that the bargaining frictions would go away and we would indeed switch from war to peace. For example, if Iran was uncertain how the blockade game would play out, but knew exactly what would happen if this were a normal kinetic war, then the half measure itself contributes to the bargaining problem. This also means that you can increase the US cost of war, yet decrease the probability of war, something that my academic alter ego once wrote about. Nonetheless, the half measure remains the more efficient option for the United States, and so that is what we are stuck with. And while that was purely hypothetical in the Iran case, it looks like it might be getting more real over in Ukraine. Russia may very well be changing its strategy soon, leading to a host of second-order consequences. Brace yourselves. So, what are our takeaway lines for today? Militaries have multiple options to choose from. The best of those options form the expected outcome of war. Changing the valuations of those options leads to some complicated strategic interactions, and it is possible that being worse at one strategy makes you overall better off. Thanks again to my preferred full measure, Ground News, for sponsoring today's video. Go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to take a fantastic 40% off Advantage plan. Also, thanks to Mike Ehrmantraut for his help. If you know, you know. And if you don't, then maybe you still enjoyed today's video, and you can like, share, and subscribe. and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.